Welcome to Mild Moodcast, a podcast meant to explore mental health through the lens of another human hanging on by a thread. I'm Bianca, a registered mental health counselor intern, soon to be LMHC, here to chat about the topics we don't get enough of. So grab your headphones and let's dive into the crazy world of mental health. It's going to be a wild ride. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Mild Moodcast. If you're just tuning in for the first time, welcome. Before I jump into today's topic, there is one thing that I've been meaning to say for my last 3 episodes. I will not be videoing myself for the video podcast portion for a little while. I moved, as some of you may know, and I can't find my camera. And the last time I tried to record with my cell phone, I didn't like the way that looked when I uploaded it to YouTube. So I will not be doing the video portion for a little bit. Also, to celebrate my birthday, I went ahead and got myself a Medusa piercing. And my lip is a little swollen. It was just the day before yesterday. So I am sounding a tad bit funny with certain words, or if I try to laugh or do anything like that. So I just wanted to let you know, if I sound a little funky today, that is why. It's so funny because I swear I never have to cough as much as I do when I'm starting my podcast. I've been drinking water all day. I got water next to me now. And every time I want to talk, I'm raspy and I have to cough. Like, come on. But anyway, again, thank you for coming back. So today's episode is focusing on grief and anger. I want to start by asking, you ever notice how fast we try to skip over grief and anger? Like, if we just don't look at it, maybe it'll go away. But it never does. It just sits there. And eventually, it starts screaming. I want to talk about why we're so afraid to feel the hard things. Why do we resist grief and anger like there's something we can outrun? And it's funny because I was so excited to get into this episode today, which might sound crazy. And what do you mean you're excited to get into the topic of grief and anger? Because people don't talk about it. So if anyone's going to talk about it, I think it should be me. So yeah, I was really excited. But, this isn't about fixing emotions. It's about understanding why we avoid them in the first place. So if a feeling balled up in your chest or in your stomach or somewhere and you were like, oof, I'm not really sure if I can listen to this today. Hey, I can't force you. I cannot force you to be ready to feel your emotions. But I can hope that there might be something that you could take from this. So if you think you can, stay. So first I want to talk about how society conditions us to bypass uncomfortable emotions. We are told to move on, to stay positive. But what does that even mean when you're pissed off or heartbroken? It's so interesting because grief and anger make people uncomfortable. And I'm not even talking about the person who has to feel them. I'm talking about everybody else. They tell us to move on, and they tell us to stay positive because they can't handle the way that it makes them feel. Isn't that so interesting? There is so much shame that's attached to anger and sadness. You're told anger makes you feel out of control, or maybe it does make you feel out of control. Maybe you think that grief makes you look weak, and because of that, we swallow it all. It shows up in our families, it shows up in our community, it shows up in spiritual circles, and even with ourselves. We say to ourselves, if I share it, it can be used against me. And our past experiences create a cycle of fear. So we choose to get over it, or so we think. When we ignore grief or anger, it deepens the wound. The more you push it down, the bigger it gets. We have this idea that if I just ignore it, it's going to disappear. It won't be here anymore. I won't have to deal with it. But when we suppress, we're actively interrupting the natural process of feeling and releasing emotions, which then leaves them stuck inside. So it's quite the opposite. I'm not releasing anything. I'm sticking it there. Emotions like grief and anger are meant to be felt and expressed. When we ignore them, in comes emotional stagnation. And you better believe it's going to resurface in unhealthy ways. That's going to look like anxiety. That's going to look like irritability. And even physical symptoms. Not only will suppression interrupt the process, but it increases the intensity. It's so amplified to the point that it feels overwhelming or unmanageable. It's like if I choose to do my laundry and I get it all in the dryer, and at this point I'm bringing it to my room and I do 3 more loads, maybe you have a lot, maybe you have kids, I don't know. All of a sudden you have 4 loads, 5 loads of laundry sitting in front of you. That's overwhelming, I think, for anyone. And it feels unmanageable. Even if you had 1 or 2 loads for yourself, a couple of pieces of clothing versus a ton, what do people usually end up doing? They leave it on a chair. They leave it in their bed. They leave it in the basket because it's just easier that way. Emotions are like that. Suppressed emotions often grow stronger as they fight for recognition. Grief might turn into despair and anger into resentment or bitterness, which makes finding a resolution even harder. Grief is one thing, despair is another. Anger is one thing, but being bitter, it makes it harder for you to be able to open up to different choices, hearing different things, having different conversation. You know, when I'm told to ignore grief or anger, it feels like those emotions are wrong or shameful, which makes it harder to embrace them in the future. You know, like I said before, society teaches us to suppress negative emotions. But this mindset creates guilt and shame when those feelings come up, and they're going to come up. They're going to come up every time. And it creates the cycle of avoidance. I don't want to touch it because it's too strong now. I didn't want to touch it then because it didn't feel right, but now it feels worse. And since I'm fearing something, what does that cause us as people to do? It causes us to isolate. And I said that with a smile because I'm human too, right? Ignoring these emotions makes me feel like I have to carry them alone, which deepens the pain of grief or anger. It's so funny because sometimes I feel like I do these podcasts in such perfect timing because, man, you guys, it's been a hell of a week for me emotionally. Because again, whole life not figured out. Hey, neon sign saying she ain't got it all together. But she does take her own advice, and that's good. So, you know, it's funny because isolation has been something that's popped up a lot for me this week. Feeling like I have to carry my emotions alone. And to be fair, it created some avoidance as a result. So we're avoiding this pain, which causes isolation, which then causes more avoidance. Isn't that such a lovely cycle? Connection is critical during times of emotional distress. Ignoring emotions isolates people. It leaves you feeling unsupported and misunderstood. I have said before that a closed mouth don't get fed. And our pride has a lot to do with why we isolate, why we feel like we have to carry it alone. A lot of times we think, well, that person has enough going on. They don't want to handle my stuff too. But if they were going through something, you would look at them and be like, why didn't you tell me? How come you didn't come? I'm always here. Because the truth is, if I don't have to think about my stuff, or if I'm thinking about your stuff, I don't think about mine. And yet we still hold it in. Unfortunately, in doing so, that prevents healing. Grief and anger are signals that something needs to be addressed, and ignoring them prevents me from finding resolution or peace. Remember that little kid pulling on your pant leg from the last podcast episode, if you listen to it? It's saying, hey, I need some attention. And what happens with those little kids, or little kids in general, when they get ignored? They get louder usually. In order to heal, it requires paying attention to and working through your emotions. When we avoid, it only delays the process. And that leads to unresolved pain that resurfaces in the future. I said that in the last episode too. Things come back a few weeks, a few months, a few years later, but they're still there because we left them to be stuck. I don't want to delay my process. And I have to think about that because sometimes I can say one thing and do another. We as humans will say, I want to be better, I want to do better, but then we don't. And I'll come back to that. It triggers emotional numbness. If I ignore my emotions for too long, it makes me feel disconnected from myself. Like I'm going through life on autopilot. And people will say, how are you feeling? And you might say, I don't know how I'm feeling. And that's genuine because you don't. Because you have ignored your emotions for so long that you're disconnected, that you don't know. Over time, avoiding it leads to numbing. And that makes it harder to feel anything, to feel joy, to feel connection, to even feel self-compassion. I'm not just numbing the pain, I'm numbing everything because the pain is just as loud as everything else. And when I do that, now I'm bottling up anger. Now I'm bottling up grief. And it's going to come out somewhere. It's going to take a toll on my body. It's going to take a toll on my mind. And it's going to leave me drained and burned out. If you notice that you're feeling drained or burned out, you're not enjoying the people you would normally enjoy as much. You're not enjoying your hobbies or your job the way that you were. It's because suppressed emotions require constant energy to keep them at bay. Notice any headaches, feeling like you're really physically exhausted or even emotionally exhausted? Yeah, that's that constant energy running to push them down all the time. And that, again, it doesn't go away. It shows up in other places. It's going to make me more irritable. It's going to make me overreact to small things. It's going to come in all of the unexpected ways. Lashing out at people you love, feeling overwhelmed by the smallest inconveniences, random breakdowns. You get to a self-checkout line at Target and there's no bags and you start crying. It's not about those bags. And I think, worst of all, it diminishes your self-trust. When you ignore your grief and your anger, it feels like you're abandoning yourself, which makes it harder for you to trust your own emotions and your instincts. You are constantly telling yourself, you're sending yourself the message that your feelings aren't valid or trustworthy. And it starts to erode your self-confidence and your intuition. couple episodes ago, I talked about how we normally have to rely on other people for the decisions that we make, for big decisions, for small decisions, for help. And we have to work on paying attention to moments where our intuition worked for us. But when we ignore grief, anger, the parts of us that don't feel good, we have damn near no self-confidence. I can't listen to my intuition because I'm invalidating the hell out of myself. I'm abandoning me, abandoning the things that need to be listened to. And even more, I'm blocking my growth. And the thing about it is, even though grief and anger suck, they're painful, they teach us important lessons about ourselves and what we need. So if we ignore them, we're robbing ourselves of that opportunity to grow. These emotions reveal such deep truths about our values, about our boundaries, our desires. And if we're ignoring them, we're missing the chance to better understand ourselves. And I don't know about you, but I want to understand myself. So even though it's scary, and even though it hurts, and even though I think that I have to do it alone, I don't. Me personally, if I hold in what I'm feeling after too long, I'm gonna explode. I actually had a little bit of a moment of grief last night. Yesterday was such a good day. Went around to a couple stores, got some goodies, and I thought that things were going so well. And genuinely, for what they were, they definitely were. They were going well. But I sat down to watch TV and eat. I ordered some Subway. I was like, all right, I'm gonna have a wrap from Subway. It's gonna be good. Gonna watch this show. And my emotions took the steering wheel. Grief flooded me and I just sobbed. The feeling exploded. Because you can have the best day, but the feeling isn't going away. And even though I work every day to sit and meditate and journal, I admit I was ignoring my journal for a couple days. I was riding the high of, this feels good, because that's our problem as humans. We're like, I did this for a few days. Now I feel pretty good. Now I feel confident in my ability to move forward. But that's the pattern. I got to a point where I felt comfortable, and then I was like, all right, cool. I don't really have to journal as much. When in reality, the reason I felt better was because I was journaling. Duh. And I don't say that to be rude to myself. I say that because that's the point. That is what we do. And I find it to be such a win that I caught that. I stopped prioritizing for a small moment, a part of what helped me feel normal. Because if I didn't say this before, this is lifelong work. Every situation you enter has the ability to leave you with any type of emotion. With stress, with sadness, with anger, with joy. So being able to still give yourself the space to process that at the end of a long day, or in the morning, beginning before you start your day, is important. Self-care is more than just journaling. But self-care isn't escaping. It isn't distracting. So if you have emotions that are floating around and you're not listening to them, like Bianca, they're going to come back to bite you in the ass. Grief isn't a moment. It's a season. And if we pretend we're fine, that season just stretches on longer. You'll ask yourself, why me? Why do I have to be going through this? How much longer do I have to feel like this? It stretches on longer and longer when we're pretending that we're fine. You know, why are we wired to resist? Well, for a long time, survival. There is survival in avoiding pain. There was a time where anger and grief were seen as threats. Something that could disrupt a community, something that could disrupt status, or even safety. Now, there's not a tiger chasing us, but we still treat our feelings like something dangerous. You know, resistance in general is natural. It's going to ebb and flow, as I've said before. But healing happens when we stop running. How do we stop running? We gotta honor these emotions. And I'm gonna keep it real. I'm not saying light a candle and meditate on your rage. I mean, just sit with it. Let it hang out. I wanna kind of go through some ways that I've allowed space for anger or grief without judgment. And I want to talk about some things that have worked and some things that don't work. You know, when I say meditate, sit with it, let it hang out, right? That means sitting quietly with the feeling and acknowledging it without trying to fix it. And I know I've said this before, but sometimes we don't hear me. Without trying to fix it. So what does that look like? Saying to myself, I'm angry because I was hurt, and that's okay. Or, I feel grief because this mattered to me. It's reducing the shame that often comes with these emotions. I don't give a damn what people have told you. That you should get over it, that you should forgive, that you should this, that you should that. Because that creates and piles on shame. I'm not saying don't forgive. I'm saying first give yourself the space to recognize why you're upset. Let me tell you what doesn't work. Trying to constantly distract yourself or telling yourself just get over it, because now they're going to resurface in unexpected and even more intense ways. Last week, I talked about naming the emotion. Writing about grief or anger in a journal. Speaking it out loud to someone that you trust, or even creating art that represents the feeling, because it's going to help to reduce the intensity and bring clarity. And be careful when I say speaking it out loud to someone that you trust, because we are all in a place of learning who is too influential in our lives and who we feel we can genuinely trust. So make sure that you know when you're speaking that to someone, it's someone who can listen with an open mind and heart. What doesn't work? Bottling it up out of fear of being judged. This can make emotions feel bigger and harder to process over time. It is so important to share, because honestly, you never really know the response you're going to get anyway. Sometimes I think that we create these ideas of, they're going to judge me, it's not going to work out, it's not going to be good, they're going to hate me forever, by just expressing yourself and your truth. And we block our blessing. We block ourselves by bottling it up. And again, that cycle of avoidance. Now I'm so scared to touch it. Now I'm so afraid to release it because it just feels like this huge monster that could mess up everything. But I'm feeding the monster when I bottle it up. There's a way that you can kind of like honor grief through rituals, like lighting a candle, writing a letter that you don't send. I tell my clients all the time, sometimes people have traumas from their parents or past relationships, and I will tell them, I want you to write a letter. I want you to get it all out. No need to filter every single thing you feel. And when we're done, burn it. You can create a small memorial for what you've lost. For anger, physical releases are so good. Tearing paper, screaming into a pillow, or doing a super intense workout. But what doesn't work is avoiding moments of reflection because they feel too vulnerable. Suppressed emotions can become unresolved energy, and it begins to weigh you down emotionally and physically. You can do something called finding a safe container. Setting aside time to feel the emotion fully. Basically, give yourself 15 minutes to cry, vent, or sit with your thoughts. Knowing that you have a set time to process can make it feel less overwhelming. Sometimes people will notice they're thinking about things all day long and it takes over their entire day, and they're still not processing the emotions behind it. When you take that specified amount of time to yourself, you're giving yourself permission to process, to feel, and it starts to lessen. And then it starts to not affect your day because you gave it space. But if you don't, then you let emotions spill into all areas of your life unchecked. While emotions need to be felt, they also need boundaries to avoid them becoming all-consuming. And you notice I didn't say, shut it up, bundle it, stop yourself. No, this is saying give it specific attention so that way it doesn't have to go everywhere. Practicing mindful awareness. Using mindfulness to observe the physical sensations of grief. I've said this before, body scanning. Good example. Noticing how grief feels heavy in your chest, or how anger makes your hands clench. The practice grounds you in the present, and it helps you detach from the emotion as something separate from who you are. If we ignore the physical symptoms, or we disconnect from our body entirely, it can lead to emotional numbing, or even physical issues over time. My personal favorite, seeking support. Talk to a therapist. I'm a therapist with a therapist. She's great. She's like my bestie. We talk. I bounce stuff off of her all the time. She reminds me, hey, take off your therapist hat. You're being a little too judgmental for yourself. And I'm like, damn, she's right. Joining a support group. Did you know that there are a ton of Zoom groups for different topics? You don't even have to leave your house. So you don't even have to talk if you don't want to, even though it's good to get it out. But sometimes just hearing someone else speak is helpful. Another personal favorite, leaning on a close friend who can hold space for your feelings without judgment. Like, I know that I'm a therapist, but before I was ever a therapist, I was that friend who could hold space for other people's feelings without judgment. And I am still that person to this day. And it might be hard to believe, but it's true. Anyone that you ask of my friends will tell you that is who I've always represented. And I don't say that with any form of pride. You know, those things that you can post on Facebook that'll be like, what's the number one thing that makes you think of me? Or the thing that reminds you of me? Or when you think of me, like what comes to mind? And it's always how non-judgmental I am and how I can hold space for others, my kindness. And that is an active choice and also just a huge part of who I am as a person. People are not afraid to tell me things. And I literally call myself Planet Fitness Judgment Free Zone. It could be the worst thing and you're telling me, and I'm like, okay. And what would you like to do with that? But anyway, find yourself someone you can lean on, that you can tell without having to be afraid of their reaction, because that matters too. Because when we tell the wrong people, it solidifies why we didn't tell people in the first place. Maybe you had an ex and you were like, here's all the things that people have done to hurt me, and they use that against you. Maybe you go to your mom and you tell her what you're going through and she invalidates your emotions. Find someone who can hold space for you without judgment. Toxic positivity, like just stay strong. Everything happens for a reason. It's not helpful. It doesn't work. Another really good thing to try is reframing grief and anger as teachers. Viewing the emotions as indicators of what matters to you. Grief reveals the depth of your love or connection, while anger often points to where your boundaries were crossed or where you need change. Let that really sink in. The depth of your love or connection versus boundaries and where change is needed. If we see emotions as weaknesses or obstacles, our mind is going to make it harder for us to engage with and learn from them. I'm so scared of the way it's going to feel. The point isn't having all of the answers. And it's interesting because I know that there are people who have tried things in the past, and I just want to say this. You may be in a time of your life where you have learned so much about yourself. You have made so many changes that you didn't the first time it didn't work out. So if I'm not the same person and I'm working to release negativity and I'm working to handle my shadows in the way that you may be, how can I think things will be the same when I now carry tools I never had? We have the ability to create whatever life we want. And as you're actively doing this work on yourself, you have all the tools you need. You didn't have those tools before. So while you think to yourself it might fail, it might backfire, I might lose it all, ask yourself what's different about right now. What do you see in yourself today that you didn't see in yourself then? And run with that. You know, the point isn't specifically to solve grief or anger. Because again, lifelong work, right? It's just to give them a seat at the table. Because they're going to show up whether you invite them or not. You can't outrun grief. You can't outthink anger. They'll wait for you. And the more you push, the harder they come back. They're just parts of us that need space to breathe. Thanks for listening today, guys. I want to highlight that once again, I will be providing some journal prompts, and this time a few ways to kind of sit with those journal prompts. I hope this resonated in whatever way you needed it to today, and I look forward to the next topic. Bye. Thanks for tuning in to Mild Moodcast. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. If you have any burning questions or topics you'd like me to cover, don't hesitate to reach out. You can find me on YouTube at Mild Moodcast and Instagram at Mild Mood Therapy. Let's keep the conversation going and continue to explore the wonderful world of mental health together. Until next time, stay curious and keep smiling.